Welcome back to News Talk on Samar News. And today we're tackling, well, a lot, actually.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
You've brought us a really interesting situation, possible shift in U.S. foreign policy regarding the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
And we've got all these crazy headlines.
Right.
U.S. splits with EU, sides with Russia on Ukraine, UN vote.
Yeah.
U.S. and Russia unite against Ukraine resolution at UN.
Yeah, I saw those too.
And honestly, I'm a little confused. I don't know what's going on here.
Well, it's a bit of a head scratcher for sure.
What's the real story? What are we looking at?
Okay, so the key here, I think, is context.
Okay.
We're at the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we've got a bunch of things happening all at the same time.
Okay.
So the UN General Assembly is voting on resolutions regarding the war, but at the same time, President Trump is hosting French President Macron in Washington.
Right.
And at the same time, he's engaging in direct talks with Russia to try and end the conflict.
See, that's what's throwing me off.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we've got these direct talks between Trump and Putin, which, that seems like kind of a big deal in itself.
Definitely unusual.
Yeah. But then we've got this whole UN situation happening at the same time.
Right.
Sending these, I don't know, are they mixed signals? What's going on?
It's definitely unusual for a U.S. president to be negotiating directly with Russia without involving Ukraine or European allies at all.
Yeah.
It sort of makes you wonder who is at the table and what their goals are.
Right.
Now, about those mixed messages at the UN,
Yeah.
remember, UN General Assembly resolutions, they're not legally binding.
Okay.
They don't have the force of law, but they do reflect global sentiment,
Okay.
which influences how countries act.
Right. So even if it's symbolic, it still matters.
Exactly.
So what was in this resolution that's causing all this controversy?
Well, so the European-backed resolution, it condemned Russia's aggression, demanded full troop withdrawal,
Okay.
and very explicitly named Russia as the aggressor in this conflict.
Okay.
It did pass eventually, but it got less support than previous resolutions condemning Russia.
Less support. Wait, is that significant?
It might be.
Okay.
It might signal a shift in how the international community views the conflict.
Okay.
There are a lot of countries out there with strong economic ties to Russia.
Right.
Some rely on them for energy.
Yeah.
Sanctions have hit some nations harder than others.
Right.
There could be a growing weariness with this war dragging on.
So you're saying maybe some countries are feeling pressure to stay neutral
Potentially.
or even cozy up to Russia a little bit?
Yeah, it's possible.
Wow.
It's worth remembering international relations are rarely black and white.
Yeah.
Each country has its own set of interests and priorities.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Good.
But let's get back to the U.S. and this shocking vote against the European resolution.
Yeah.
I mean, even for Trump, it feels like a pretty dramatic move.
Yeah, it definitely raised eyebrows, even among some of his own supporters.
Right.
There are a few possible explanations. Trump has been very vocal about wanting to negotiate directly with Russia.
Yeah.
He's also expressed doubts about the level of support the U.S. should even be giving to Ukraine.
I remember on the campaign trail, he was talking about wanting to improve relations with Russia.
Right.
Is this part of that strategy playing out now?
Potentially.
Okay.
It's also worth considering maybe a shift in U.S. foreign policy priorities in general.
Okay.
Trump's America First philosophy, maybe that's influencing his approach to this conflict.
Okay.
He might be weighing the costs and benefits of continued U.S. involvement in Ukraine and deciding maybe a different approach is needed.
So he votes against the European resolution,
Right.
and then he drafts his own resolution.
He does.
It's like he's trying to take control of the whole narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And initially, Russia seemed open to the U.S. proposal,
Okay.
but then France stepped in with backing from other EU allies and made some really significant amendments.
Luckily, now this is where I get a little lost.
Okay.
What were these amendments? What was the big deal?
So the EU amendments, they very specifically stated that Russia carried out the full-scale invasion of Ukraine
Okay.
and reaffirmed the international community's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity,
Okay.
which were 2 points the U.S. draft kind of left out,
Oh, interesting.
which raised concerns for the European allies.
So they're basically saying, we need to make sure everybody knows that Russia is the aggressor here
Right.
and that Ukraine's borders are not up for grabs.
Exactly.
But why was that so important for them to include that?
Well, because the concept of territorial integrity, it's absolutely fundamental to international law.
Okay.
It essentially means a country's borders are inviolable.
Right.
They can't be changed by force.
Right.
The EU is drawing a line in the sand here.
Okay.
They're saying we will not allow Russia to just redraw the map of Europe through military aggression.
And what was the U.S. response to these amendments?
Well, the heavily amended resolution passed,
Okay.
but the U.S. abstained from voting on its own resolution.
Wow. That's awkward.
You gotta admit, it's a little
It
awkward.
definitely sent a message, yeah.
Yeah.
So is this the beginning of a rift between the U.S. and Europe? I mean, are we seeing that start to happen?
This situation definitely highlights the diplomatic tension and the strategic maneuvering happening behind the scenes.
Right.
The U.S. may have miscalculated their influence at the UN,
Okay.
and the EU successfully defended their position on this.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder,
Yeah.
is this just a bump in the road, or is it something more serious, like a sign of deeper cracks in the Western alliance?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I'm a little worried about what this means for Ukraine stuck in the mud of all of this.
It's a valid concern. Zelensky needs international support.
Right.
But this situation is creating a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
We really have to see what the U.S. does next, because they're planning to bring their original unamended resolution to the Security Council.
And that's where things could get really interesting, right? Because the U.S. has veto power there.
Exactly.
Okay, so the U.S. might veto a resolution condemning Russia in the Security Council.
Right.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around how we even got here.
It's definitely complicated, but to understand the potential impact of a U.S. veto, we really need to understand how the Security Council works.
Yeah, it's one of those things I sort of know about,
Right.
but I could use a refresher.
Sure. So the Security Council is the UN's most powerful body.
Okay.
It has the authority to make decisions that are legally binding on all member states.
Oh, wow.
Including authorizing the use of military force.
So it's not just about symbolic resolutions like in the General Assembly.
No, not at all.
This is where the real action happens.
This is where the real action happens, exactly.
Okay.
And within the Security Council, there are 5 prominent members.
Okay.
The U.S., Russia, China, France, and the U.K.
Okay.
And these 5 countries have veto power,
Right.
meaning that any one of them can block a resolution,
Wow.
even if all the other members support it.
So even if the entire Security Council agreed that Russia's actions in Ukraine need to be condemned,
Yes.
the U.S. could just shut it down.
They could. That's the power of the veto.
Wow.
It's a legacy of the post-World War II order.
Okay.
It was designed to prevent another global conflict by ensuring that all the major powers were on board with any major decisions.
I see, but in this case, it seems like that power could be used to protect Russia,
Yeah.
even if it means further alienating U.S. allies.
That's the dilemma facing France and the UK right now.
Right.
They're forced to choose between aligning with the U.S., which might damage their credibility on the world stage, or siding against the U.S., which could weaken the Western alliance.
So lose-lose situation.
It is. It's a high-stakes game, for sure.
Yeah.
And while we're focusing on all this diplomatic maneuvering,
Right.
it's important to remember that this is all happening against the backdrop of a real war
Yes.
with very real consequences for the people of Ukraine.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in all the political drama and forget about the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, what does all of this mean for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people?
I think Zelensky is in an incredibly difficult position,
Yeah.
trying to lead his country through an invasion while navigating these shifting international alliances.
Right.
He needs the support of the international community,
Yeah.
particularly from powerful allies like the U.S.
Of course.
But he also can't afford to appear weak or willing to compromise Ukraine's sovereignty.
So he's walking a tightrope, basically.
He is. He's walking a tightrope, and this situation raises a lot of questions about the future of Ukraine.
Like what?
Well, what happens if the U.S. continues to shift its foreign policy away from actively supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Will European allies be able to fill that gap?
Right.
These are big questions.
And what about Russia's perspective on all of this?
Yeah.
It seems like they're gaining ground diplomatically even as they face setbacks on the battlefield. What do they stand to gain from all of this, even if they're not achieving a decisive military victory?
Well, Putin is a master strategist.
Right.
And he's clearly playing a long game here.
Okay.
He's trying to exploit divisions within the Western alliance,
I see.
weaken international support for Ukraine,
Right.
and potentially secure some concessions that would allow him to claim victory,
Okay.
even if it falls short of his initial goals.
So even if Russia doesn't fully achieve their military objectives, they could still come out of this looking like they won.
Exactly, at least in the eyes of their own people.
Wow.
And that's why it's so crucial to understand the different perspectives at play here.
Right.
It's not just about who wins or loses, on the battlefield or in the diplomatic arena.
Right.
It's about how these events shape the future of Ukraine,
Yeah.
the balance of power in Europe, and the broader international order.
Wow, I'm starting to see that this situation is much more than just a disagreement over UN resolutions.
It is.
It's a reflection of these larger, more complex issues.
Absolutely. And it highlights the challenges we face in what's becoming a multipolar world.
Okay.
You know, for decades, the international order was largely defined by the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right.
But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. emerged as the sole superpower,
Yeah.
shaping global politics and economics.
The New World Order that everyone was talking about.
Exactly.
But that seems like a long time ago now.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's because in recent years, we've seen the rise of other major powers like China and Russia,
Right.
and even regional players like Iran and Turkey.
Yeah.
This shift in the balance of power is creating a much more complex and unpredictable world,
Yeah.
where the old rules no longer apply.
So how should the U.S. respond to this new reality?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It feels like we're caught between trying to hold on to our position as the global leader.
Right. And adapting to a world where we can't just dictate the terms anymore.
It's a difficult balancing act for sure.
Yeah.
The U.S. can't just dictate terms like it might have in the past.
Right.
We need to build coalitions, negotiate with rivals, and be more strategic in our use of power.
Which sounds a lot easier said than done.
It is.
Especially in a situation like this where there are so many competing interests and priorities.
Right.
So what does all of this mean for the average American?
Yeah.
How is this global uncertainty playing out in U.S. domestic politics?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
So we've been talking about this potential shift in U.S. policy toward the war in Ukraine
Right.
and how it's playing out on the world stage. But I'm kind of curious, how are Americans reacting to all of this?
Well, it's a real mixed bag, to be honest.
Okay.
Public opinion is divided,
Yeah.
largely along partisan lines.
Right.
You have folks who really support Trump's efforts to engage directly with Russia.
Okay.
They see it as a bold attempt to try to end the conflict.
Right.
They argue maybe the U.S. has been too involved in Ukraine
Yeah.
and that it's time to prioritize American interest.
Right. So America first.
Yeah, exactly. Putting America first.
And on the other side of the coin, you have those who are seeing Trump's actions as appeasement,
Right.
almost like a betrayal of our allies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're worried that Trump is undermining the Western alliance,
Yeah.
emboldening Putin maybe even.
Right. Yeah.
They think the U.S. has a moral obligation to support Ukraine.
Okay.
We can't just abandon our commitment to democracy and freedom around the world.
So this is basically just amplifying the existing political divisions within the U.S.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It's playing out in the media, on social media,
Yeah.
even in Congress.
Right.
You see accusations of being pro-Russia or anti-American being thrown around.
Yeah.
It creates a very toxic environment for any kind of nuanced discussion.
Yeah. It's like people are picking sides in the conflict and then just viewing everything through that very specific lens.
Right.
Rather than trying to step back and understand the complexity of the situation.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the problem. We've kind of lost the ability to have civil conversations about these really important issues,
Yeah.
and that can be dangerous.
Yeah. So with all this division, how do you think this issue might play out in the upcoming election?
It's really hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean, foreign policy doesn't always take center stage in U.S. elections,
Yeah.
but this situation has the potential to be a defining issue,
Yeah.
especially if the conflict in Ukraine escalates,
Yeah.
or if there are more diplomatic clashes with our allies.
It seems like a real tightrope walk for the candidates.
Yeah.
Appealing to their base,
Yeah.
but also needing to appear, I don't know, presidential and capable of
Right.
handling these really complex foreign policy challenges.
Exactly. And every word they say, every policy position they take,
Yeah.
it's going to be scrutinized through this lens of the U.S., Russia, Ukraine situation.
Wow. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how they navigate that.
Absolutely.
This whole thing feels like a powder keg politically.
It
Like you never know what's going to set it off.
Yeah.
The potential is definitely there for things to get really messy.
Right. I think it's a good reminder of how interconnected domestic and international politics really are.
Yeah,
Decisions made in Washington have ripple effects around the world.
of course.
Events on the global stage can have a huge impact on American society.
Right.
We can't ignore those connections.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From those surprising UN votes to the potential consequences for the Western alliance,
Right.
impact on U.S. politics.
Yeah.
It's clear that we're witnessing a really pivotal moment in history.
I think what's most fascinating is how this situation really exposes the fault lines in the existing world order.
Yeah.
It's kind of a wake-up call that the old assumptions and alliances,
Yeah.
they can't be taken for granted anymore.
Right.
We're entering a new era, one that's much more complex and uncertain,
Right.
and it's going to require all of us to think critically and engage thoughtfully with these challenges.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what should we be paying attention to as this story unfolds?
Well, I think there are a few key things to watch.
Okay.
First, keep an eye on the diplomatic front.
All right.
Will the U.S. and its European allies be able to repair this damage to their relationship?
Yeah.
Or will this rift widen further?
Right. Good question.
Second, pay close attention to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Okay.
Could these diplomatic shifts actually lead to a de-escalation of the conflict?
Yeah.
Or will they just fuel the fire?
Right.
And finally, I think we all need to watch the domestic political landscape here in the U.S.
Yeah.
How will this issue play out in the upcoming election?
Right.
How will public opinion evolve?
Wow. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. It is.
But as we've seen today, it's all interconnected.
Absolutely.
What happens in one arena can have huge consequences in others.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to stay informed.
Yeah.
To ask questions
Right.
and challenge your own assumptions.
Absolutely.
The world is changing rapidly,
It really is.
and we need to be prepared to adapt.
Well said. Well, with that, we've come to the end of our deep dive.
Yeah.
But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Exactly.
Keep exploring this topic, seek out different perspectives, and form your own conclusions.
Right.
The future of international relations is something we all have a stake in.
We do.
And the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the challenges ahead.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
It's been a pleasure exploring these really complex issues with you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.